If you had been allotted the opportunity, asks Michael Mix, what would you have discussed with Nietzsche? Well, I think I would have discussed with him what the psychoanalysts discovered in the 20th century, or what they claim to have discovered, which I believe was a genuine discovery. See, when Nietzsche announced the death of God, which, by the way, as you may know from listening to my lectures, was not precisely a triumphal, it wasn't an announcement of triumph. It was a warning and the tolling of bells of sorrow. That's a good way of thinking about it. Even though Nietzsche styled himself as an intellectually vicious critic of institutionalized Christianity, which he certainly was, he was also a strange friend to the faith. I think in the most fundamental sense, that's the truth. He wrote some things about Christ, for example, which were very positive. And I think the reason he understood as well how important the narrative substructure of the Judeo-Christian tradition was to the maintenance of Western civilization. He's one of the people I learned that from, you know. So when Nietzsche announced the death of God, he did it sorrowfully, and then he tried to think about what we might be able to do about that, because it was going to lead us down two bad pathways, either towards nihilism and the belief, or what would you call the direct experience, that because God was dead, everything might be permitted, as Dostoevsky pointed out, or totalitarianism, which would arise as a rational substitute for the dogmas of religion. And he knew that both of those would be catastrophic occurrences. And so he was trying to figure out what we could do to heal ourselves, I suppose, as a consequence of this great loss, because Nietzsche also believed, well, I mentioned this, that, you know, the belief in God, which is not something so simple as belief in, you know, a bearded man in the sky. It's sad to even have to say that, and maybe it's not necessary, but at least, you know, more profoundly, that the death of the idea of a universe ordered by something that's akin to the living and conscious and aware and intelligent. It's rough to replace that with pure random meaninglessness. And of course, that's the pathway to nihilism. Anyways, Nietzsche thought we would have to create our own values to replace those that would fall because of the death of Christianity. And the psychoanalysts, Freud and Jung, particularly Jung, but Freud began it, I think, and Jung made this explicit, I think, found a fatal flaw in Nietzsche's theorizing. And maybe it's a fatal flaw in relationship to modernism per se, even to the idea of rational thought itself as master of its own house. You can't make your own values. Like, you can aim, you can direct your life, you can cooperate in determining the values that you pursue, but you cooperate with forces in yourself that aren't you and can't be made you, not in any straightforward way. And it's easy to understand this if you think about, for example, the fact that if you do something that you shouldn't do, or if you don't do something that you should do, that you'll lay awake in bed at night and torment yourself about it and worry about it and consider yourself an unworthy person, you know, as if you believed in the idea of sin. It's a very strange thing that there's an ethic that calls to you from within that you can't control, that holds you responsible for your actions. And that's just one of many sub-personalities in some sense that are operative within people. I mean, it depends, I suppose, on how integrated their personality is. The less integrated people are more different depending on what emotional state they're in. But, you know, the you that's overwhelmed with grief, or the you that's overwhelmed with love or lust, or the you that's overwhelmed with anger, possessed by those things, is really often by no means the same you that you like to think of yourself as when you're under full conscious control and in your normal state of mind. I mean, even the idea of drunkenness, intoxication, that's possession by a spirit, right? That's why whiskey is a spirit. It's the spirit of Dionysius. And you drink and you become something that you normally aren't. You know, they say in vino veritas, but it's not necessarily reasonable to believe that everything you do and say while you're intoxicated by alcohol is true. The point is that there are multiple personalities at work within you, and they have a fair bit of autonomy, like a strange autonomy. If you could just create your own values, you could imagine, in some sense, you'd be doing what Raskolnikov tried to do in Crime and Punishment, which is a book I'd really recommend. So he believed that Nietzschean idea that you could create your own values. And as a consequence, he decided to murder a terrible old woman who was oppressing many of the people in her neighborhood and seemed loved by no one and hated by everyone, and who was a vicious slave master to her not very bright niece. And Raskolnikov thought that he could do away with her, that would get him out of some financial trouble, and then he would do good things with the money. And that if he was a real Superman in some sense, in the Nietzschean manner of thinking, that he could just dispense with all the guilt that might logically be associated with murder, because after all, if there's no God, everything is permitted and we can create our own values. And Crime and Punishment is an unbelievably deep study of what happens when you cross a line that you shouldn't have crossed because of your own arrogance. And so Raskolnikov, this is a thriller, this book, you know, a real detective story. Well, I'm not going to blow the plot, but he's sort of successful in the murder. He gets away with it, although it doesn't exactly turn out the way he expects, even the act itself. But what he discovers in the aftermath of what he did is that he was nowhere near as in control of himself and his personality and his emotional reactions as he thought. And he tortures himself for a very long time with very interesting psychological and social consequences, as well as driving the plot ahead very rapidly with what he's done. Absolute, stark, traumatized disbelief at what he's done. And so what I'd like to ask Nietzsche, because that's the question that I'm supposed to be answering, is, given the mutability of man, the fact that we are composed of multiple subpersonalities, which, by the way, was something that Nietzsche actually mentioned and that I believe that both Freud and Jung relied on when they were formulating their psychoanalytic theories, given the fact that we aren't masters of our own houses, given the fact that we're divided amongst ourselves, how in the world is it possible for us to develop our own values when we're a mass of internal contradictions, and each of those contradictions is a consequence of something live trying to make its case made? You know, like if you were your own creation, whatever that might mean, if you were in full control of your own consciousness and emotions and motivations, well, then you certainly wouldn't be guilty about things you didn't do or did do, because you could just revamp your value structure at will to optimize, let's say, your emotional state. And, you know, it's good to some degree to be able to do that, to cheer yourself up and to dampen your grief. But man, you're not as in control of yourself as you'd like to think. And you're haunted by many things that you could be and many things that you are. One of the things that really terrified me, I think, enough to change the way I was living when I was studying psychology, was that encounter with that psychoanalytic idea that you're not alone in your psyche. You know, you can even tell that if you're a student, if you're trying to read something that you have to read. You know, there's a difference between reading something you have to read and something that you want to read. If you want to read it, you can just read it. If you have to read it, you might not read it at all. You might just procrastinate endlessly. Even if there's an important outcome like an exam, even if the consequence of that exam might be failing a course and destroying your academic record, you'll still find yourself very resistant to read the paper unless you happen to be personally interested in it. And that's so interesting too, because even at that level, you're not the sort of person that can create their own values, man. You can't even convince yourself to read a piece of complex writing if you're a university student enrolled in a course that you chose that assignment is part of. And so that's a pretty good indication of just how many directions you're pulled in simultaneously. So I would really like to discuss that with Nietzsche. I would like to know what he thought about that. Maybe he thought that despite our dissociability and the multiplicity of our personality, that the possibility or the necessity of creating our own values was the only chance we had. But what I learned from Jung, and this is probably the most profound thing I learned, I think, of all the things that I know, perhaps, is that values aren't created, they're discovered. And they're discovered through a consultation with the parts of yourself that you're not conscious of, that you're not fully conscious of, that aren't fully articulated elements of your primary personality. You have to discover what your values are. And you're informed about that, well, partly by other people who will object if your values aren't appropriate, but certainly by a dialogue with yourself and with your conscience. That's a very important thing to know. It's part of the reason why I think that you need to tell the truth, because you're forced to negotiate with yourself to operate properly in the world. And if you've warped yourself, let's say, or some elements of yourself by engaging in self-deception and lies, and you're not now, because of that, you're not who you could be, and you don't live in the world as you should live in it, then when you discuss with yourself what your value should be, it will be as if you're discussing it with someone that you can't trust. And that's not good. Like, you can't afford that. Life is difficult and it contains many pitfalls. And unless you're careful and you sort yourself out properly and you aim high and walk on the straight and narrow path, you don't have a hope of understanding where you should be and at what time when the crisis hits. And the crisis will hit. So you want to get all those little sub-personalities in a line if you can. It's part of the reason, for example, why Jung thought you had to integrate your shadow, which is the dark part of your character. He thought that was necessary, or it would go and have a little autonomous life of its own, maybe manifesting itself, for example, when you're angry or drunk, instead of integrated into the rest of your personality like a properly disciplined player in a complex and sophisticated game. So